How do you source interior design samples and what do you do with them once you're finished with them? Well, first of all, let's start with the question of why do we need interior design samples anyway? Well, first of all, we use them to get inspiration for a project, but the more important thing is we use them to get accurate understanding of what the finishes or the end result is going to look like. So it's almost impossible to work on a project without having a visual example of the sample of what we're going to be putting into the property. So this is, I these days work more with digital samples more so than the physical samples, and I think this is a big transition. So once we go through this topic, I'll explain a little bit more about it. But first of all, where do we get samples from? Well, if you're working on a project, you'll go directly to the supplier to get the sample that you're looking for a specific product. So that might be a tile supplier. It could be I've done it with kitchens to get the door samples for a particular door style, finishes, floor finishes, wall finishes, carpets, anything and everything that is going to be part of your design, including finishes, veneers, and even not only paints, but applications onto surfaces. So, for example, like fire retardants onto fabrics. All of these things we would need samples on to see how it affects the finished result of a product. If you're building your sample library. So if you're working on a specific project, you could just go directly to the supplier to get the sample, or you can use something like Swatchbox or Material Bank is another one. There are others on the market, but these these are great because they've been around for a couple of years now, but they literally can give you the sample the next day, only if you're obviously a professional designer, but then they will take them at the end of the life, which is really, really great. I'll get onto that in a second. But what happens if you're building your sample library, and where do you get like a body of samples that you're going to be working with, and how do you know where to get all of these samples from? Well, the way designers do it is we go to trade shows, and that's where we create relationships with suppliers. And with those suppliers, we can get our material sources. So some of these are paid. Some of them I've only ever paid for one. One kind of selection. So it's still not that. It's still quite rare to pay for them, but it depends on the supplier. But most of the time, if you're at a trade show and you're a real designer, you will be most of the time you'll be able to have your samples for free, or they'll take it out of the cost of the project. So you shouldn't be paying really for samples unless they are, like, for example, in the last couple of years, I've had to pay more so for large samples. So small samples usually will be free to the trade, but if you're requesting super large samples, these might be paid for, and I've had to do that recently because people are requesting more larger formats. But apart from that, so that is where you would be sourcing your samples from. So if you've ever wondered where to get them from, that's where you get them from. How do you store them? Well, when it comes to the project, I store them in project folders, project trays. I've even had project file boxes. Depending on the size and scale of the project, the complexity, the amount of samples that I've got on that project, usually I can just store it in a folder, and I'll have just the samples for that project within that folder. If I'm sourcing for a much larger project, I'll usually need a box because there's just so many samples. When I'm working out a sample design, I'll usually use a tray, and obviously then whatever room I'm working on is in that particular tray. For storing them, however, I just literally store them in little boxes. People go all out and purchase really expensive storage containers. These were literally, on a project, and you'll see this on your projects, you'll have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of containers that get thrown away on a building site. And I literally got, we were installing on one of the projects, these light waves. We literally had hundreds of these boxes, and in the end I used them for my library. So that was a good way to just upcycle some old boxes, and they literally store really well because they're a nice little set of boxes that I can like switch up and use. And they're actually in really good condition, considering these are now probably about 4.5, maybe 5 years old. And they go, I mean, we go through samples quite a bit. So obviously they're stored in drawers. I don't just keep them out, but they're protected within the drawers, and we do update our material bank and our library quite regularly, which I suppose is, the next thing besides how to store it within your library is what to do with the samples after you've finished on the project. And this is a big one because interior design samples can be seen as, well, will be seen as commercial waste. And how you deal with commercial waste is you might be charged to dispose of the sample. Even if you got the sample for free, you might be charged to remove it from, especially if you're working in a residential address. So that is a big problem for designers, not only for us professionally, but also in terms of waste and obviously the environment. So what do you do? Well, you can either upcycle, recycle and donate. So the thing I do is, well, when I was moving, I donated one of my old libraries, my whole sample library, to a new interior designer who was starting out. So that was a good way for me to kind of purge my library and give someone else a head start, which was a really nice way to really get rid of, a big bulk of samples that I was no longer using. Of course, not all of them would have been current, but that isn't always relevant when you've got a sample library. We don't use the sample library specifically just for current sourcing and referencing. It's more about inspiration and developing a scheme and building a scheme around that. So that is still beneficial for that. So you can donate. You can donate also to schools and to people who do crafts, especially with material samples and fabric samples, not so much with tiles. They're a big problem. Veneer samples are more like plastic finishes. You've got a bit more variety of things that you can do with those, especially for crafts and donating to schools and things. But I would, if you can't reuse the samples, obviously that is the best thing, which would be to reuse the sample on on other projects and upcoming projects. So reuse, recycle, and donate, or only work with product suppliers who can recycle or will retake their own samples back. This is really hard with tile companies, but I have found companies who will do it. Obviously, that's why Swatchbox and Material Bank are really great, because they will take the samples back. It's really, really critical, because the impact we're having on not only the environment, but the waste that we create as designers just through our thought process and our design process is huge, something we really need to consider. So if you only work with suppliers, it's not always possible, but if you do really genuinely go out of your way to only work with suppliers that will take back samples, then that is not only reflective on the way that you run your business, but will also be reflective on the projects and the clients you start to attract as a designer. What about updating your sample library? Well, these days, there's no excuse, unless you're a really large firm, there's no excuse to have a huge sample library. I personally believe that if you are not like in the past, we used to have so many samples, and it's just not, it's not sustainable, not only like for the environment, but not sustainable in a business to constantly have this, this turnover of samples. It's really wasteful, but also you've got to have space to store all of these samples, and having all of the samples, it's just there's just so much you need to do with it, and then obviously if you have to pay for it to get rid of it, that's quite annoying. But if you can't request a digital example of the sample, and these days there are so many more options to get a digital sample. Of course, most of the time you'll want also the final sample of the finished result. But once you've been through the design process, in the past, designers would just grab a load of samples and make up their mind with the samples in front of them. But if you just slightly alter your design process to use the visual examples, because we've got excellent digital photography these days. I know it's not exactly the same, and I appreciate that. I am a designer. It's not exactly the same, but you can get very, very, very good and very, very close to make at least a final decision and, come to a selection of 2 or 3 rather than 10. So if you only choose 3 samples to order rather than 10 or 15, then all of a sudden you're already making a difference and only ordering really specifically what it is that you're looking for, rather than just ordering loads of samples and then making a decision, and then what are you going to do with all the rest of the samples. So I think really thinking about, when you're updating your sample library, what samples you actually physically need, and if you don't need them, if you don't store them, that you're going to reuse them again, or it's not something that you will use for mood boarding or inspiration, think about trying to return those as quickly as possible, because at least when you're returning them, they might still be current and relevant for someone else to use, rather than outdated samples that no one else can use because they're no longer in stock or they're no longer in production. So that's the kind of roundabout, like how to source them, what to do with them once you've finished with them. So tell me, where do you get your tiles from, and what do you do with them after you finish? Share it, and let's continue the conversation below.